Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing another really awesome guest who is back for his third time on our show. We're honored to have him again. Today we have the honor of being rejoined by Bill Taranto, president of both Merck Global Health Innovation Fund and the Merck Global Health Private Equity Group. He is founder of both and responsible for leading these capabilities at Merck. And as a bit of a review, the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund was established back in 2010 as a strategic response to various challenges in the market surrounding Merck's core businesses of pharmaceutical, discovery, development, and manufacturing, and marketing of innovative drugs and vaccines. Bill has over 3 decades of experience in the healthcare industry. He's been managing this $500 million evergreen fund focused on identifying various opportunities that are adjacent to Merck's core business of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And under his leadership, they've invested, I think, to date in over 70 companies, deploying about $1 billion of capital, and with about $7 billion in exits, have been very successful in their mission. Again, prior to joining Merck, Bill spent close to 2 decades at Johnson & Johnson in various roles as VP of Healthcare Strategy and Venturing at J&J. He was responsible for evaluating, creating new healthcare business models throughout venture capital and acquisitions. And prior to J&J, he spent 8 years in the investment banking world. We're honored to have him back. We're going to talk about a lot of interesting things from a 2024 perspective. Bill Taranto, thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show.
Thanks, Ira. I always love talking to you. It's always a great podcast, and really looking forward to reviewing what happened in the past and a little bit what at least I think might happen in 2024 and beyond. So always look forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, most definitely. And I look forward to seeing the vision for 2024. As you mentioned, I would love to start off, for those watching and listening, meaning for the first time, would sort of like to go back to the beginning a bit in your background story. If you could take us for a few minutes through a little bit more about you, and if you can reintroduce the Merck Fund, because as we've talked about, and as I just introduced in the bio, a little different than some of the other corporate venture groups that we've profiled from the pharma industry, where their approaches have been more sort of early stage drug entities that are not ready for sort of the internal development chain. In Merck's case, you're completely adjacent to the core business of pharma and vaccines. Talk a little bit about the fund and a little bit about your background, if you would, again.
Yeah, sure. As you said, kind of fell into everything as always happens in life. Nobody's from people my age when we started. I graduated back in '85, but started banging and fell into J&J. And what was great about J&J and what I got to do there was like I said, learn a lot about the different parts of the business, which was fantastic. But when we started, doing the investing, what was fantastic about J&J is they really let us learn, and that's what I think over time made me really successful, not only towards my end of my career at J&J, but certainly at Merck, where when we first started investing back in, this was when I was in Europe and looking at technology, it wasn't even called HIT, it wasn't called digital, it was just kind of technology in health, I guess, at the time. And the whole idea, at least at J&J, which somewhat mirrored why Merck was interested in me coming over, was the whole idea with the group was to look at the future of healthcare, and could we predict the future of healthcare and then invest in assets that were adjacent to J&J to prepare them for that future. And, you know, technology, it's sort of around the early infrastructure of data. You know, we call it HIT, you know, the EMR systems, all this kind of stuff was just starting to bubble up. And people might not remember, but in Europe, and kind of why we started there was they were so far ahead of the United States in cell phone technology, and their use of, you know, pads. You know, I don't know if you remember the Palm Pilots, the giant Palm Pilots, all those kind of things. People don't always remember those things, but Europe was way ahead of using those, and we started to look at how do we use that kind of technology to communicate with the physician and the patient. And, you know, this was very early stages of that. And then we brought that kind of practice back to the US and started looking how we invest, you know, broadly in healthcare. And, you know, we always joke that one of the big first investments we did at J&J, we kind of failed. It was around trying to deliver 80,000 Palm Pilots out to the, you know, physician world, and it didn't work. We found ourselves in a hardware business instead of the software and communication business, which we want to be in. But what it taught us was kind of the way we started to think about investing. How do you peel back the onion? How do you think about ecosystems? What was, you know, driving the entire market, and why did it fail? And it led us to that. Our first successful investment, which we did with Pfizer, was SureScripts. We created that, you know, e-prescribing hub with the chains and the independents, but it taught us this whole idea of what sort of led us to then what we used to do at J&J was this whole idea of still predicting the future, but trying to think about how does the ecosystem work together, and how do you think of more of an integrated solution versus a point solution. And we were very fortunate, like I said, where J&J let us go, and we kept building more success and more success. And then a little bit out of the blue, got a call from J&J, a gentleman named Merck Turner, who was the chief strategy officer and was very interested in what we're doing at J&J, and said, we'd love if you'd be interested to come over here and do what you're doing for J&J for us. Slightly different, but, you know, in most cases, very similar. And so in 2010, joined Merck to start their venture capital activity. And what was sort of fascinating about Merck was, most people don't realize this, but in 2010, we started this digital and tech fund. And 5 years later, they started their MRL Ventures, which is their traditional life science fund. And so very odd that, you know, a company like that, which was very forward thinking, that had a tech fund long before their therapeutic fund, which is just a little unusual. But, you know, again, they liked what we do. And I was able to bring my team over. And what that did for Merck, and Merck got a lot of advantage of all the learnings we did at J&J, because we got out the door immediately. What was a little different at the beginning of the fund, we didn't actually even start at 500 million. We were a $125 million fund in 2010. We doubled it the next year, and then 2 years later, doubled it again, because we were growing so fast. But the original remit was a little different. In 2010, what Merck was asking us to do, Merck at the time wanted to be more of I wouldn't say mimic J&J from the standpoint of being diversified, but they wanted to be a broad healthcare company. And most people don't remember this. We had a lot of primary care drugs. We hadn't even had Keytruda yet. And so we were actually tasked to invest in external companies that we could ultimately Merck could own and build revenue and EPS for Merck, and be a sort of a diversified healthcare company. And we did that pretty successfully up until 2016, where then Merck did the fundamental strategy shift, where we launched Keytruda and became a biopharm company. Mm-hmm. And kind of over time, you know, got rid of our women's health franchise, kind of our primary care franchise. And today we're a full biopharm company. And what they said was that remit's still okay, but could we begin to focus a little more on pharma services broadly for the industry, and pharma services for Merck specifically? And that runs across, as we've talked about before, everything from R&D, you know, things like AI and ML and drug discovery, new novel platforms using technology, target ID, you know, focus on zero gravity clinical trials. So, you know, the whole R&D space. We, you know, moved into the manufacturing and supply chain space and IT, which is all around data. We still, you know, we're doing patient-facing things around access, remote monitoring, clinical decision support, care coordination, and of course, real-world evidence and data is still a big bucket of ours. But if you really look at it, it's just pharma services. So that was a big fundamental shift. So the whole idea was still to kind of follow what we did at J&J, predict the future of healthcare. Could we help not only the pharma industry, but Merck understand where the industry was going, and then prepare them by making sure these assets exist in the world? It's not so much about acquiring them as they used to do. It's really more about these existing. And then the secret sauce is what the pharma, you know, if Pfizer was better at AI and ML at drug discovery, guess what, Merck? You better get better at it. And that's okay that you're using the same asset. It's just you got to try to learn it. The only place that I would say that where I would see acquisitions still occur pretty heavily in this space is in that target ID area, because it's obviously if a company identifies a target, that farmer is going to try to buy that asset because it's relevant to them. But all the other stuff that we do really is more about making sure that these assets exist and where we're servicing not only Merck but it's about pharma services and how we make the industry better. And that's really kind of what we've been doing today. And as you said, we've done over 80 something, investments. I think we're sitting on 45 portfolio companies today. So big fund, still a $500 million evergreen fund. We're in the process of securing an extra 250 million to increase it, just because we're doing more and more investments for Merck that we did in the past, much more strategic probably than we were in the past. Right. So we've gotten a lot closer to Merck, and obviously over time, if we can be successful both financially and strategically, then we're doing exactly what we've been hired to do. That's a little sort of background of where we are today. So again, focusing on pharma services mostly, but still deploying a lot of capital. We're still trying to deploy close to 100 million a year, bring in hopefully that much or more, with access to keep the fund moving. And from a staffing, we're still small. We still have 5 managing directors that do the investing for us. And then we recently hired some 3 junior people. I don't know if we talked about that last year, but we finally expanded the fund to have some analysts that are the future. We had to start getting some succession planning in place, because this is our 15th coming up in April of next year will be our 15th anniversary that we'll be celebrating as well. But we got to get the next generation ready to take over the fund when it's time for me to retire at some point in the future. And the rest of the team, is roughly in the same boat. So we got to get the fund secured and ready for the next generation. But we think we have a good model in place that will just continue over time. It's a really, to your point, it's a little unique from the standpoint of other corporate ventures where we're Merck employees, but we operate very independently from the standpoint of we're an independent LLC. All the investment thesis and strategy is done by the team. We have a board, but it's a yes/no function, the board. And we run our own transaction shop. We manage all the investments to some kind of disposition, whether more investing, we sell it, it didn't work out, whatever the disposition is, we manage that. So we call it freedom to operate, if you recall in some of our past podcasts that we did. It's a kind of a unique way of working, but we're pretty excited about where we're going and what we can do for the industry and Merck as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I'm sitting here thinking back a few careers for myself, having been in retail, and thinking about what Merck was in terms of mainly a small molecule pill company, and seeing it today. Yeah, it's as you were saying, it's a biopharma company, and but a successful one with amazing super blockbuster products, and yeah, it's just been an amazing evolution to sort of watch it from the outside. And as you were saying, you've been successful at what you and your team are doing. And let's rattle a couple of these off. Livongo, acquired by Teladoc for close to $19 billion. Preventive Solutions, Boston Scientific acquisition, $1.25 billion. You took Ciox public, a $7 billion IPO. Extremely successful exits happening. But as we chatted last year, we ran into a little bit of an issue. Obviously, we had an economic crisis and a major global pandemic that we were coming out of. And not all the portfolio companies, just that's the nature of the VC game, can have a $7 billion IPO or a $19 billion acquisition like that. You introduced us to some of your strategies at the time. One major one, of course, was the hope. That's not going to work. Hope is not a business model. You can hope for a $19 billion acquisition, but that ain't going to get it done. And you had to talk to some of your portfolio companies, say, look, it's 2023. It's been tough. You got to do this honest appraisal of where you are now. You're going to have to do some down rounds and talk to your syndicate and get things in order, or else, there's going to be some issues in the coming months. Talk about 2023 and a little bit of, I guess, how the portfolio heeded your suggestions, your warnings, and a little bit of how some of the syndicates you worked with jived with what you were teaching at the time to the
Yeah, so
visitors.
if just for a little background for everybody, where all this mess came from is, if you recall, back in 2021 was an unbelievable year for digital health, right?
Right.
More capital came in, more companies got funded. Unfortunately, what happened was, because there was so much new capital coming in, and maybe not a lot of discipline, there was a lot of companies that raised at rounds that were at massive valuations, which obviously, as in time went on, that we began to see at the end of 22, and which really then kind of showed its ugly head in 23, was these valuations were not supported by the current P&Ls of these companies. So what did they do? They raised a lot of debt. But then, as you recall, we had the big, SVB incident where that shuttered the debt market after SVB collapsed. And so there was just no access to capital because investors were pulling back. They didn't want to invest in these companies at those kind of valuations. And whether, it's some hubris of the boards or the other investors where they wouldn't take down rounds or just reestablish themselves, we had a lot of failures last year. And what we're, not to jump to 24, but that's still continuing a little bit in 24, and we'll get to that. But what we did, we're a growth investor, so it's a little different. Your companies are a lot more, not that we don't face issues, but obviously when you're a growth investor, these companies are a lot more mature. And so you have a little more stability. We did, I think, a good job in much what we preach, that, hey, we need to raise as much as we can. We might have to take a flat round or a down round, but that's okay because you're still alive, right? And we can rebuild the company to get back up to a more, robust valuation where we can bring more capital in. And that worked really well for us because we're starting to see in 24 some of our, refinancings that we're doing. We're getting the capital to come in, and we're starting to raise at slightly higher rounds or up rounds from where we were. But you have to have that discipline to kind of just take your medicine. That's really what it is. Now, we also do what everybody else did. We raised a lot of debt. And of course, as we mentioned, raising debt just kicking the can down the road. Now, we have some companies that have debt coming due this year, and we're going to have to raise for them as we go forward. But the good news that we started to see at the end of 2023 is at least companies that were in sort of the startup and seed capital is coming in there. And then in the growth equity where I sit, capital's coming in as well. The issue that's still prevalent, and we'll get into sort of 24 in a little bit, is that A and B round companies in 23 struggled to raise, and they're still struggling a bit today. However, what we are seeing are sort of light at the end of the tunnel, where we are starting to begin to see a little bit that capital starting to come into those rounds, and they're getting funded. But if you'll indulge me a minute to jump into 2024, because it kind of just moves right in.
Sure.
What we have to think about is 24 is a bit of a recalibration, but it's a great opportunity year though. But some companies still have to face the music, as we're talking about. They're going to still have to raise at a reduced valuation. They're going to have to seek some kind of acquisition or exit or shut down, right? That's their options. But in a lot of these sort of middle round companies, they're going to have to do what we sort of did in the growth round. Take your down round. Mm-hmm. Worst case is the cram down, but you still kind of are alive. But what you don't want to happen is bankruptcy or closure, right? So you've got to kind of sort of think through and a little bit take your medicine, but there is capital coming in, and that's the most important thing. And that's okay, though. What people don't realize is every industry has these sort of recalibrations, and we actually think it's good for the market. We need to get those high valuations reset, right? And that's actually going to be a good thing for digital health as we move forward. And a lot of these shifts will set the sector up for brighter days ahead. We'll have a smaller cohort of stronger players, right? Because either companies close or they get acquired, and there's going to be some sort of consolidation, but that's good. So we'll see that synergy through consolidated efforts or offerings. And then I think as you get into the third and fourth quarter, we're going to see more successful IPO probably happening in this space, and a lot more capital than coming back in at moderate valuations, but capital coming back in all areas, whether it's startup or seed, sort of A and B rounds, and sort of that growth equity. So I actually think it's a positive sort of outlook for 24 as we get past sort of the first quarter's mimic sort of what happened in 23, but we're starting to see in the second quarter much more capital coming in, light at the end of the tunnel. But certain companies are still going to have to face the music and certainly have to raise at the rounds that weren't what they expected. But the whole idea, I think, of the space is to stay alive, right? Sure. As long as you're still moving forward, that's a good thing. But I actually believe a market recalibration reset is actually really good for the market. I think it's going to be a positive that this kind of happened in the end, because there was just no sustainability for most of these companies at those kind of valuations. Sure. But we just saw, I don't know if you saw the press release that's coming out, I think today, for Transparent, which is one of our portfolio, Glenn Tolman. Right. He just raised 126 million at an up round at 2.2 billion. Nice. Right now, that's a growth company, but nonetheless, good companies will raise the money. Right. And so we see right there a good growth company that just raised at a high round and raised a lot of capital, and still moving forward in the way that we want to see them moving forward. But there's a lot of great things happening in the market. AI, as we that's I think really reshaping the market. So there's good growth there. I think machine learning, the whole e-clinical, the space I was talking about. For pharma, we're investing across all pharma heavily into sort of that whole idea of AI and ML and drug discovery, target ID, novel platforms. The e-clinical and drug discovery areas are being consolidated now, but lots of money coming in. But again, there's going to be winners and losers across all these sectors, and some are going to get picked off by pharma because they'll, as I said before, they'll validate an asset, and that's good. And then others, because they all do it slightly different, we just see a great opportunity for consolidation, and that's one of the plays we're going to revamp up our private equity firm. Is one of the things we've done this year, and working with other large private equity firms to start trying to consolidate the market a little bit. So we see great opportunities there. But I just think it's actually a really good outlook for 24, and I think there's a lot of good things happening within the market. But we just we still got to get over some of the pains of 23. It hasn't fully reset itself, and those pains aren't going away just yet. Right.
So no, awesome. I appreciate you taking us into 2024. So just to summarize a little bit, so we have these investors that got a lot more selective in 2023, opening up a little bit more cash coming in, and then, as you were just mentioning, from a sort of big sky perspective, digital health, AI, machine learning, telemedicine, it's no joke. It's a big area. A lot of exciting things happening both in the United States and abroad. I thought it'd be interesting just to drill down on some of the sort of the opportunities within sort of the big basket. And I know we've chatted about some of this offline. I thought we could touch on a few of these. I know one of the sort of the interesting areas that you've talked about has been obesity management, and this is something that I don't know, I'm saying a dirty word here, but we've had a couple of the Novo folks on, talking about the sort of GLP-1 and everything that's happening there, and I think that's been a major surprise. And Novo recently created this transformative prevention unit for obesity, saying, hey, obesity is it's not just heart disease and diabetes. It could be hundreds of other diseases, but it's not going to be just drugs. And the opportunities for digital solutions, and they're talking about this, it fits nicely into Merck's the fund's thesis here. It's about managing these drugs. It's about weaning them on and off. Talk a little bit about obesity, if you would, and obesity management as you see it from the fund's perspective, and the potential for this beyond just the drugs.
Yeah, now us as GHI, we haven't invested quite in this space yet. We're kind of waiting to see, if Merck moves into this space. But notwithstanding, this is $100 billion market, and they believe that will be $100 billion market by 2030. Obesity it's sort of like if you think about where diabetes was maybe 10 years ago, from 2000 to 2020, the prevalence of obesity in the U.S. grew 31% to 42%. So it's a problem, and it is associated with diabetes, and obesity will, drive demand of the GLP-1 category, which is the Ozempics of the world that you mentioned, to be over $100 billion market. And they actually see that growing just tremendously I think the number was 30 million by 2030 will be GLP-1 users. So you can just see this whole obesity. And then what I think is really interesting is there's going to be other types of drugs coming out in the obesity market. So that's going to be the GLP-1 drugs, but that's what's prevalent today. But what's going to happen is payers are going to face significant expenditures in obesity. So what they're going to be looking for then is digital solutions that help manage those patients, much like we've had with Livongo managing a diabetes patient.
Yep.
What are you going to do to help manage these obesity patients? Because this epidemic certainly isn't going anywhere. So we actually think, this is a really, really big growing market. And this is going to be, this is kind of one of my predictions of 24. This is going to be probably one of the fastest, biggest growing areas where you'll see digital solutions coming into the market to try to help these patients along with the drug or drugs that are going to be coming out to manage this particular market. So I think this market is just going to explode. It's not going anywhere. Okay. And what we've seen from the R&D market is lots of companies coming up with all sorts of different types of potential future medications. They're not out yet, but it's not just going to be the GLP-1s. It's going to be other types of obesity drugs. Because remember, the GLP-1s were traditionally for diabetes patients. It just showed that you could lose weight on them. Yeah. Now, the only, interesting thing about these particular drugs, I think that we have to be aware of is the more sort of off-label use of non-diabetic patients taking these drugs, what's the long-term effects, right? We don't know that yet. It's still, you read all these articles, Ozempic face and whatever that means, but, it's just being make sure that these, all these things are safe. And we don't know the long-term effects yet. We're just learning those, but certainly a lot of patients that aren't diabetic are using it, but it's having, especially in obese patients that aren't diabetic, tremendous weight loss stories we're seeing. So they're having great effect. It's just whether or not patients that maybe aren't quite the right type of patient to be using it, what's the long-term outlook on that? But nonetheless, the market's going to grow. I think this is by far one of the biggest areas that's going to impact digital coming forward.
Mm-hmm. Another important piece, of this equation that, I've seen you write about a little bit in your socials has been sort of the health equity component as digital is concerned. And, I've seen you write about social determinants of health, remote monitoring, things like that. There's another interesting part of the health equity equation that we recently recently did a show with Elizabeth Garner from over at Ferring, who's also the head of the American Women's Medical Association, and she introduced us to this theme of femtech, which I know you had something in your social blog a couple months ago about it. But here is another sort of area of health equity we don't think as much about, that even in 2024, we don't know as much as we really think we do about the difference between men and women and the importance of these tools beyond just the drugs, again, in bringing health equity to the fore in the femtech area. Say a few words about this, if you would.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We used to have a huge women's health franchise, and we spun that out, and it's now called Organon.
Yep.
So we're still big believers in it, but if you think about it, there's certainly they're not necessarily underserved, but that's about the best word I can come up with. But it's sort of like women's health doesn't get the sort of recognition and the attention it should, as well as sort of the geriatric population as well. There's different type, and then to your point, all those things are great categories for health equity investment. And part of where it all stemmed from, the one interesting thing about the pandemic, that did underscore the disparities in access to care, where we saw all sorts of different sort of issues arise, whether it was around wealth, the zip code you lived in, your ethnicity, all the different things that can affect whether or not you get, access to care. And then what we found is a lot of digital solutions effectively help those patients. And where a lot of it started was that sort of social determinants, and that's sort of addressing that underlying factor driving healthcare needs. And like I said, it can be anything from where you live to, you may not even have a car, right? How do you even get to where you need to be? The other digital area that really took off during, the pandemic was telehealth and patient engagement. And that's still one of the biggest growing areas. And, no matter the population, to your point, whether it's women's health or sort of the geriatric population or any underserved group, this is where telehealth has, I think, really impacted the population as well. The only issue with telehealth right now is it's been fabulous for acute conditions, but where it needs to evolve is how do you help chronic patients? You know, maybe patients that are suffering from high blood pressure or some cardiac issues. How do you get telehealth to work better in sort of the chronic area? It couples itself with remote monitoring and remote care, and really what monitoring does is it really improves outcomes through active monitoring of healthcare conditions. And when you kind of couple that then with clinical decision support solutions and add that social determinants piece on it, where you're looking at the health equity, all these pieces, when you put it in that ecosystem, really then help any population. And you mentioned women's health. We're a big, I wish, we're just not investors in it because we don't have that as a franchise, but we're big supporters of it. We actually help support Columbia Hit Labs Women in Tech event every year, just because we still believe in helping as many populations as we can, even though we don't necessarily invest in it. So we at least try to support it in other ways. But to your point, from a social determinant piece and access and getting technology to, I just call them underserved populations, that we see quite a bit. The geriatric population or aging in place population is a big area, but across, minority, rural, where there's little or no access, all these technologies can bring better care and better access to patients. And I think we can learn a lot in developing countries, how they start to use technologies, because, access is even worse as you get into those kind of places. And can we port some of that back here to the US, where some of those simple solutions around just using an iPhone, right, to help with health literacy, just simple things like that are really important. So again, I think it's still a massively growing. I think the telemedicine and remote monitoring piece of that is really going to impact the social determinant piece as it goes forward in 24. So another big area in 24.
Absolutely.
And we're investing in part of that. We can't do the telehealth piece because of, as a pharma-owned venture capital firm, we have to be very careful of anti-kickback statutes where we're not in the corporate practice of medicine and we're not putting undue influence on a physician. So we can't own anything that has a physician as part of it, but we can do like the remote monitoring piece. We can supply the technology piece of telemedicine. We just can't be in that practice of telemedicine. So we do pieces of it. We can certainly do the social. We have a big company, Unite Us, that we invested in. That's a big social determinants of health company that we're really proud of being an investor in. So we do pieces of it. And of course, care coordination and those type of tools that help the patient on their journey are all parts of health equity in the end. We're more on the periphery of pieces of it that we have to be just based on being a pharma owned. We have to be careful of some of the things we do as it gets towards the patient side.
Right.
It's still a big area again for 24, I believe.
Bill, I don't know if it was the last time we chatted, the time before that, but I tell this anecdote about a venture capital unit that I talked to a couple of years ago, which it was like April of that year, and the person told me that by April alone they had seen 100. I remember this number: 183 business plans for startups that had something to do with artificial intelligence and health. I don't know what the number is nowadays, but clearly this is an area that, on one hand, it's hot. On the other hand, as you pointed out, there's going to be consolidation here, because I don't know if it's 500 or 1,000 or how many companies out there doing something with AI and drug discovery or AI and e-clinical development or whatever. Take us into where you think this is all going, because clearly the tools have been there. We see AI attached to everything nowadays. In some ways, it's taken on sort of that quantum terminology in certain cases. Where are we going here? Where do if you're obviously putting your looking in your your crystal ball, what's going to happen as we get into further in the year into 2025? What is the AI machine learning domain going to look like?
It's a great question, and what people don't realize is parts of AI have always been around. It's what's happened is with the large language models and Gen AI, it's all progressed now over time to just be that much more powerful. The question is where is it going to be used in healthcare, and what's sort of the right places? as we talked about, one of the biggest areas I just see in pharma anyway is probably the biggest area of investment is sort of that target ID, AI and ML and drug discovery. If we can identify a target 5 years sooner and get it to market sooner, that's, saves time and money, costs less for the patient, gets the drug out faster. But the question is, we're invested in 10 or 12 of these types of companies, but they all do it slightly different, right? And we don't know if one of these are actually going to work yet. We're waiting for the validation to occur that actually one of these work. And then once that occurs, that's what's going to then springboard that piece. We see a lot of it in sort of the e-clinical space as well. But broadly speaking, the whole question is whether or not a lot of this AI needs to be regulated, and perhaps it does. Because what we see is, in a regulated industry, you can at least control some of what's happening. I think that's probably one of the things we'll see in 2020, 24, and 25, perhaps, that you're going to get some government involvement in it. But all this AI does have its limits, though, right? It's only as good as the access to the data it has. There are omissions in data, so it doesn't always read everything correctly. There's sort of what we call opaque models. It's probabilistic by nature, but it's really good, though, for the industry. And there's going to be plenty of AI applications to prove, healthcare. I think one of the other areas that we're seeing, aside from that drug discovery space and e-clinical space, one of the big areas, strangely enough, is in the supply chain, where it's really grown because it's all about data. And of course, where AI works its best is around data. And if you think around how pharma at least works, how do you track goods coming in, raw materials coming in, and then goods going out? We lose a lot of our goods to fraud once it's at ship, or lost shipment, damaged goods. But how do you track and trace all that to make sure that you're shipping it the right way? Are you shipping it by plane, because that's better than train, or by sea, or by truck, or what are the right way to ship things? How do you monitor the temperature control of things like vaccines? All this stuff is all AI enabled and driven. And so we're actually really putting a lot of capital to work in sort of the supply chain area as it relates to the data side of it, because we see tremendous efficiencies in how AI can help our supply chain and the way we're going forward. So we think that's another big area. Certainly AI, as it relates to real world evidence and data space, is going to be big. How do we curate the data much better and faster than we were before? How do we take disparate data sets and bring them together and look at those data sets differently, which is going to then change, obviously, the way we look at post-marketing and R&D. So that's another big area, I think, for 24 that's still going to keep growing. So AI has its place. I'm not an AI expert, so I'll certainly say that to the audience at all. I just know we see certain applications, at least early on, where we think it has value in the pharma services space. I can't talk much beyond that, but I think to your point, it's everywhere. And everybody says now, almost every company I meet, it's kind of funny what you were talking about before. Every company I meet now says they have AI. And the question is, what really do you have, and what is the AI doing? And you got to dig into that, because just because they say they have AI doesn't mean they really have the kind of AI that we're looking for to do the type of things that we want it to do as it relates to pharma services. So it takes a tremendous amount of due diligence and bringing outside experts to look at that kind of technology to make sure it does what it says it's doing. So we probably do, I would say, a lot more diligence in this space than we do in other spaces, just because it's hard, right? But I'm, like I said, we're really excited about that sort of drug discovery and e-clinical space, clinical development space. We love the supply chain space, and we certainly see in the world of evidence and data space where it's going to have applicability. It's a great, again, I think this is probably beyond obesity, the number one talked about topic in healthcare certainly is AI and its use. The one question that's going to be interesting, which I didn't address, was sort of the patient side, and why maybe regulatory might be interesting is because AI can access data faster and look at data. What if it happens if the data finds something out about a patient you weren't supposed to find out, right? What's the obligation to reveal that? There's a lot of legal things around as you get closer to the patient side, not so much
Right.
the sort of clinical development, supply chain stuff. That's much more static. But I think we just have to be careful as it gets closer to the patient, because there's a patient privacy, HIPAA, all those kind of things probably come into play that don't necessarily come into play in some of the other areas. So
Right.
just something
Uh,
I don't have an answer for. It's just it just would, to me, seems like that's probably an area where regulatory might have to step in, just because
right.
we need patient protection.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, again, they don't really think that much on that side of things because we're usually been talking to folks on the sort of the early stage, like here's my fancy AI thing, and it'll allow all this magic to happen. But we've been as a show sort of starting to discriminate a bit more, and instead of focusing on the sort of the magic boxes, we've been talking more with the companies that, hey, I got an AI candidate here, and my phase one is beginning, and let's see what happens, how good this AI is going to be versus the traditional folks in the lab. No, it's yeah, I appreciate that you laying that out though, Bill. Um, one thing I neglected again at the beginning of the show this time. I know I mentioned in the last show, but aside from your responsibilities per the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund, you also served this role as chair of this HIT Lab Breakthrough Alliance, which managed this consortium of various groups that were diffusing knowledge about these digital health innovations over the last couple of years. And they have their big conference coming up in a couple of days, and I know that you're going to be giving an important keynote there. I think this year it's in New York City at the
Mhm.
Microsoft Tech Center. Could you say a few words about your HIT Lab responsibility, and then a little bit about the conference that's coming up May 6th to the 8th, and what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah. So there's two pieces. So there's HIT Lab and there's the Breakthrough Alliance, and they work together. It's all part of the Columbia's HIT Lab Breakthrough Alliance. But what HIT Lab does, which is fascinating, they validate from a clinical perspective a company's solution. And so what would happen as a startup company or any company at any stage, if they want a clinical validation of what their product is or their service is, which then helps them get reimbursement or FDA approval, HitLab has a methodology around scientific validation from a healthcare perspective of these assets. And so that's that piece of it. The Breakthrough Alliance piece is the community piece of it. It's where you bring entrepreneurs, students, investors, payers, providers. It's bringing the whole community together. And obviously, this started out of New York, but I would say it kind of covers the tri-state area. And then obviously with Columbia as part of it, a lot of the international students and people that graduate and move on to other parts of the world, they bring a really interesting community together. And so I share that piece of it, which is the community piece of it, which is, again, part of it's just giving back, what I try to do. But the whole idea is, how do you bring healthcare community together? And this just happens to be sort of the East Coast sort of area where this is taking place. And then what Columbia HIT Lab came up with, Stan Kashnowski, who chairs the HIT Lab,
Mhm.
was how do you sort of create the very beginning of a sort of JP Morgan for
Yep.
healthcare on the digital side, right? Because if you go to JP Morgan, in San Francisco, it's more about the therapeutic, um,
Sure.
biopharma, traditional pharma industry, med tech industry, all those kind of things. But how do you think of that in terms of digital and technology? And of course, New York is a preeminent place. So what they did was they put together this conference that's going on next week for 4 days, where they brought massive amounts of big players from New York, whether it's Columbia Presbyterian, it's every big hospital within New York, big spot, J&J, because you're just thinking the tri-state area, Merck,
Sure.
Pfizer, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all these big companies are part of it to try to launch for the first time. And then can we grow this into an annual thing where over time it gets, probably this week, because it's the first one, you might only get 300 people, maybe a little more in person, but it's just starting that. Could you have an annual New York City Digital Health Week that grows into a big conference where people from around the world come to talk digital, much like they do the traditional JP Morgan conference to talk biopharm and all those kind of things out in San Francisco. So it's the first one. We're launching it. They're the sponsor behind it. It will be at the Microsoft Tech Center in Times Square. So beautiful center there. Microsoft's a great partner in that. And so, yes, it's the first sort of gathering to get this conference launched and see if we can turn into something big. And if it's a success this week, then or starting next week on Monday, we'll they'll certainly try to grow it. And again, it's all about bringing the digital and tech community together for a very specific conference around solving problems in healthcare. And so it's a great, to be part of, and we'll see, fingers crossed. I'm very confident that it'll be a success. But that's the whole idea behind it. Could you create this sort of, loosely equivalent to a sort of a JP Morgan for digital.
I totally get the analogy.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just though I have beyond HitLab, because I have watched, you give various keynotes and talks, sort of in the YouTube world. You obviously get out there talking about digital health, about the portfolio. Anything else coming up for 2024 in terms of the public facing stuff that we should know about while we have you today?
Yeah, I think one of the things and that where digital's going, I think, is really important. And it gets back to almost what we talked about at the beginning when I was telling you kind of the learnings we got from investing at J&J and how we brought it over to Merck, was this whole idea of integrated solutions. And what we're starting to finally see is that concept of moving from point solution to integrated solution is really taking hold now in sort of the digital health space. And what we're going to see is digital health solutions being integrated into healthcare delivery. And what you'll see is that sort of that digitization and automation of healthcare systems just will offer great efficiencies to move away from these points. Now, everything starts as a point solution, but the whole idea is, if you think about banking, that was kind of an example that I give in a talk, is that digital transformed the banking industry, but it didn't replace banks, right? Banks still exist, but it gave the ability to use your card globally. Everybody has an ATM card that you can use globally, and it really digital became another just channel for the bank, right? And it created not only efficiencies but revenue, right? Because now you can bank globally without having to worry about where your branch is. Right. Everything's automated online. Most of us do banking online today. Healthcare is moving in that direction, and it's really important that what we're starting to see is that the systems, the hospital systems, the providers, everybody wants to move this sort of this integrated solution. And the idea of how it works is, and the way we think about it as an investor is, I think I've talked about in the past, is we do this thing called ecosystem investing, right? Where we take a use case, which is something we're trying to solve in healthcare, and we start with an anchor tenant. An anchor tenant maybe it's a large point solution. It solves maybe 50 or 60% of the problem, but you have gaps. And what we'll do is we'll invest around it to fill those gaps. And then what we do is we get those companies all to work together. And then the whole idea is, over time, is can we create a single company using our private equity firm to deliver that big integrated solution to the system? Because that's what they're looking for. And that's where digital is moving. And I think that's an important piece to understand, is that we now have a way to move these point solutions into more integrated solutions. And the message to the digital health audience is, no matter what you've created, you have gaps. Nothing solves 100% of anything in healthcare. And if you recognize your gaps and look for those partners and think about a way to build a better solution, you don't have to always merge and come together. You just have to think about, how do you partner to bring a better single solution to the system? And that's what everybody's looking for. Pharma's looking for it. They don't want to go to 50 vendors to solve something. The payer and provider don't want to do that. They want these sort of more integrated solutions that work better across the system. So we can learn a lot from the financial sort of community about the way they structured and did it. We can learn from the banking industry around how they automated and and even though banks compete, you can use your ATM card. If you're a Wells Fargo client, you can use your ATM at Citibank, right? You might pay a fee, but you can do global banking. We can do global healthcare. It's just, how do you get these systems to start to be integrated and work more from a single solution than a point solution? And that's kind of the idea. So I think that's kind of one of the other sort of important pieces of what I see really starting to happen in 24. I think the only other area that we didn't really touch on is, it's just sort of an interesting area. We do some investing, but sort of that cybersecurity and data policy area,
Mm-hmm.
I think will take center stage in healthcare. Making sure that you have patient protection, really good data, and it's extremely important how healthcare happens. And we've done some infrastructure investing over time where we invest in data security, privacy and storage, data aggregation, integration, and harmonization, and certainly in the analytics and informatics on top of that. So in terms of a stack, but we've seen a massive rise in hacking. We just saw United Healthcare, their CEO was at Congress, I think it was yesterday, reporting on their data breach. So all these type of things around cybersecurity, and this is where AI, I think, is going to help tremendously, where it can help sort of these healthcare organizations deploy robust procedures and policies to ensure privacy regulations are met. So this whole cybersecurity and data privacy and policy is going to take center stage because we can't have all these data breaches occurring still. Like I said, we just saw United Healthcare happen to, but everybody's exposed, from pharma to the providers to the payers. And we can't have those kind of security breaches where patients' privacy is hacked into and arbitrage in ways that we don't want it to happen. So I think one other area that I'm really robust about in 24 is this whole, how do we figure out this sort of better patient protection, cybersecurity, and what tools are going to be available to make data that much more cleaner and safer for us to use, because it's so important, right? Data, our whole phrase is always data is the currency we use to transact in the future market, and that's the basis of our investment thesis. All of our companies are data companies, but in order to, even where I invest on pharmaceuticals, for those things to work, we need that infrastructure to be there, and it's extremely important. So I'd say that's a sort of big area that I think in 24 that's going to grow. But I'm really robust about 24. I think for growth investors, it's a great area. I think we see opportunities for consolidation. I think money's coming back into the market for those A and B rounds, but it's going to be slow. We're still going to have closures, so there's still going to be some hard times. But the startup and seed capital, that money's all coming back in. And I do see, hopefully by the fourth quarter, the public markets begin to open up and we'll see another Livongo, right? And hopefully it's one of my companies.
So, God willing.
But one thing I'll say too, we didn't have any exits the last 2 years really because the market was so, but we're starting to see interest back in our companies. I expect us to have, maybe at the pace we were, that's still to come maybe in 25, but I think we'll exit 2 or 3 companies this year and then get back on our normal pace of sort of that 5 to 6 exits per year and then getting back to investing in 8 to 10 companies a year. We slowed down a little bit. We're probably more around the 4 to 5 just to not have too big of a portfolio because, we're sitting on 45 and that's a little big right now. We obviously want to get that down to the mid 20s, but that's going to take a couple of years for us to do that. But I'm very optimistic about where the market's going, and it just takes time. But this recalibration, like I said, is actually a market recalibration is actually good sometimes. And this, I think, is going to be overall for digital because it resets the bar of what's the right valuations, what are the right amounts of money, what's the right thing to build that gets this sort of respect from the public market side, where you have good P&Ls. That are attracted to investors, and they can understand them. That it's not a brick and mortar, but that's okay. That these are, P&Ls are matching brick and mortar P&Ls, even though it's a digital company, and they're good investments over time. So I'm actually very bullish on 24. But we just got to get through this sort of first quarter, which we are, and moving into the second quarter now, where it's starting to pick up.
And as you're saying, you take this the small, strong cohort that you have, you consolidate, and you have this ecosystem model that you're talking about, and take advantage of these synergies. It's going to be interesting to see we'll come back in 2025 what these exits, these IPOs, what the deals look like.
That'll be great, if you and I
and
talk
Lord
in
willing,
February next year, we'll see January and February of next year when we have this conversation again and see if I was right. That'll be good. But I feel like I said, there's signs, right? You can always just see the signs, and the biggest sign always is capital coming back.
Yeah.
And it is. And the one thing is, the private equity firms are sitting on a lot of capital. They didn't deploy very much over the last 2 years. So they're probably looking at their chops going, oh, this is a great time to consolidate as well, right? Because there's nothing wrong with these assets. They just couldn't raise capital at the valuation they wanted. They're good assets. So I think they're looking at this as well as a really robust time to make some moves. So I think we're going to see a lot of private equity capital jump back in beyond the venture capital money as well. So it should be, good year by the end of the year. So
I look forward to episode number 4. But it's always great having you, Bill.
I appreciate it.
Again, you open our eyes to the topic that we don't normally get into, but it's very educational, and I really appreciate you spending time with us. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks, or again watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Bill Taranto, President, Merck Global Health Innovation Fund, and Merck Global Health Private Equity. Bill, again, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule. Thank you for imparting your knowledge as you usually do. And as we say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for everybody via your promotion and the innovation that comes out of the investments that you make. Really great story, and great seeing you again.
Thank you very much, Ira. I always like talking to you and look forward to our next conversation. Thank you very much.